Under Saturn's shadow, the wounding and healing of men. What that's all about is here's the introduction, and we'll get started with that. And then we'll go ahead and read chapter 1. This book derives from a talk given at the Philadelphia Jung Center in April 1992. That talk was long overdue. I had personally avoided the topic for a decade, even though men's suffering, aspirations, and healing had progressively occupied my time as a Jungian analyst. 12 years ago, the ratio of women to men analyses in my practice was 9 to 1. Currently, I see more men by a ratio of 6 to 4. I believe this shift is replicated in the offices of other therapists, and the reasons for it have also contributed to the rise of the men's movement. I avoided the topic because so much seemed in flux. At best, I saw a massive work of scholarship and emotional cleansing. At worst, a pop psych phenomenon I found distasteful. I am very much concerned with the healing and transformation of individuals. This work is usually so intense, so deeply personal, that it is often easy to forget the larger world and the vast social problems of which we are all a part and through which we are all wounded. But it became increasingly clear to me that the stories of individual men did overlap and present consistent motives. As women have learned before us, I began to realize that the collective experience of men is an inescapable part of their personal history as well. The warp and woof of private history and public mythology meld into the formation of individual character. By now, of course, there are many fine books on various aspects of the dilemma of modern men. In this book, I shall draw from them at times, directly, consciously, and gratefully. We are all part of the struggle toward community, and each of our voices has a different ring. I do not aim to offer an original contribution to men's scholarship, but rather to take complex matters and distill them, integrate them, and express them in terms that can be apprehended by many. Similarly, I draw upon the clinical experience of men in therapy. To them, also, I am grateful for permission to use their material. The purpose of Under Saturn's Shadow, then, is to offer a, a sympathetic, a synoptic view of men's wounding and healing, and to examine where things stand in the last decade of the century. But even more, a sort of confession. I avoided speaking out on this subject for many years, not only because the issue seems so much in transition, but because I too have suffered from living under the shadow of Saturn and am not always clear about where I stand in relationship to my own masculine nature. Fate had it that I be born into the male gender. For many years, I simply took that accident and its consequences for granted and believed it more frightening than liberating to try to step out from under the shadow. In the pages that follow, I shall cite autobiographical examples from time to time, not to indulge myself, but because I think them typical and representative. As the painter Tony Burlant observed, the more personal and introspective a work of art is, the more universal it becomes. In focusing on men's issues, it is not my intention to minimize the wounds of women. We of the male gender owe a deep debt of gratitude to those women who have spoken out, not only to express their own pain within our sexist culture, but also to free men to be more fully themselves. Their cry de coeur has helped men look more consciously to their own wounding, and we are all better served as a result. The example of women struggling to free themselves from the shadows of the collective gives courage and makes it necessary for men to do likewise. Unless men can emerge from darkness, we shall continue to wound women and each other, and the world can never be a safe or healthy place. This work we do then is not only for ourselves, but also for those around us. In the middle of the last century, the Danish theologian Soren Kierkegaard observed that one could not save one's age, only express the conviction that it is was perishing. The unconscious forces, the public institutions, and ideologies that guide our lives have such inertial momentum that one cannot hope to bring rapid change to society and its gender roles. However, the first requisite is that men become conscious of the fact that they are grievously wounded. The unconsciousness of their trauma causes them to repeatedly wound themselves and women as well. I often puzzle over how women could not grow to hate men who oppress them, and almost equally how men grow to hate and fear each other. Then this is a book that draws on the work of many in order to bring individual men to greater awareness and to further the dialogue that must transpire for healing. The images consciously and unconsciously governing our lives can only be worked through in private, individual suffering, but the growing ability of men to confess their grief and rage, to participate in a growing conversation with each other, will also help to heal the world's wound. I invite the reader to see him or herself in the journey described here. For women, the description of the struggle with the mother complex, for example, may be useful in understanding that strange ambivalence which seems to afflict the men in their lives. The masculine journey has many passages, many perils. The rigors and tasks we can identify are those we are most likely to experience meaningfully. It is not true that what we do not know will not hurt us. Indeed, what we do not know hurts us deeply, and, like Samson, we may then blindly pull the temple down upon our own heads. To bring each of us to greater consciousness of male transits and torments, I am obliged to tell male secrets. I reveal them so that women might better understand. Some of these secrets may be new to men themselves, though I seriously doubt that a single male reader of this book will disagree that they point to wounds he has carried in his own isolated and frightened heart. If we may not end the wounding and the fear, we may at least end the isolation. The title of this book alludes to the fact that men, as well as women, labor always under the heavy shadow of ideologies, some conscious, some inherited from family and ethnic group, some part of the fabric of a nation's history and its mythic soil. This shadow is an oppressive weight on the soul. Men labor under it, oppressed and blighted in spirit. The experience of this weighty shadow is saturnine. The definitions of what it means to be a man, male roles and expectations, competition and animosity, the shaming and devaluing of many a man's better qualities and capacities, all lead to the crushing weight. The burden has always been there, but today men of courage are beginning to question the necessity of living under it. Saturn was the Roman god of agriculture. On the one hand, as a god of generativity, he helped create early Roman civilization. On the other hand, he was associated with a string of dark and bloody stories. His earlier Greek incarnation, Kronos, was born in the male principle Uranus and the female principle Ge or Gaia. Uranus hated his children for he feared their potential. Legend tells us he was the first to devise shameful actions. His wife Gaia fashioned a sickle and induced Kronos to attack his father. Kronos struck and severed his father's phallus. From the drops of blood that fell on the earth were born fearsome giants. The sperm flecked, fecundated sea gave birth to Aphrodite, whose name means born of the foam. Kronos, Saturn, replaced his father and became a tyrant of equal magnitude. Whenever he and his consort Rhea produced children, he ate them. The only child who evaded this fate was Zeus. In turn, Zeus led a revolt against the father, and a 10-year war ensued. With Zeus's triumph, many civilizing forces emerged, but he too fell prey to the power complex and became tyrannical. Thus, the Kronos-Saturn story is one of power, jealousy, insecurity, violence to the principle of Eros, to generativity, and to the earth. As Jung once noted, where power is, love is not. Along with the great capacity for empowerment that the gods dramatize, we see its corruption and the power complex. Power in itself is neutral, but without Eros, it is haunted by fear and compensatory ambition, driven to violent ends. As Shakespeare observed, uneasy lies the head that wears a crown. Most men through history have grown up under the shadow of this Saturnian legacy. They have suffered from the corruption of empowerment, driven by fear, wounding themselves and others. Modern men may feel there are no alternatives, that Saturn's legacy is the only game in town. I don't believe it is. Under Saturn's shadow is offered to the reader in order to identify some of the many ways in which this dark mythos has scarred our souls. My hope is that it might move each person to look within and to seek greater personal freedom. The 8 secrets men carry within. Number 1. Men's lives are so much governed by restrictive role expectations as are the lives of women. 2. Men's lives are essentially governed by fear. 3. The power of the feminine is so immense in the psychic economy of men. 4. Men collude in a conspiracy of silence whose aim is to suppress their emotional truth. 5. Because men must leave mother and transcend the mother complex, wounding is necessary. 6. Men's lives are violent because their souls have been violated. 7. Every man carries a deep longing for his father and for his tribal fathers. 8. If men are to heal, they must activate within what they did not receive from without. Thank you so much. That is the introduction. Stay tuned for part 1. Chapter 1. The Saturnian legacy: tapes, roles, expectations. Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. Thus began Jean-Jacques Rousseau's The Social Contract, or Principles of Political Right, in 1762. We all are born free, bearing the germ of wholeness and health. And then life happens. Since children are dependent upon their parents and their culture for the fulfillment of basic needs, they are quickly estranged from that natural being. We are all socialized to serve and maintain the collective, family structures, and social institutions that have a life of their own but require the repeated sacrifice of the individual to sustain them. In the texture of our bones, in the fabric of our nerves, in the corridors of memory, we carry that precious child still. Who of us, like the young James Aji, did not lie out on the grass under the stars of a summer night and wonder at the mystery of it all? The child intuiting the large questions before it. We are talking now of summer evenings in Knoxville, Tennessee, in the time that I lived there so successfully disguised to myself as a child. As the big folk came out after dinner, adjusted the bell spray of the sprinkler, rocked on the creaking porch swing, the child we were drifted off into reverie until sleep, soft smiling, draws me unto her, and thus receive me, who quietly treat me as one familiar and well beloved in that home, but will not, oh, will not now, not ever, but will not ever tell me who I am. Aji's remembrance of things past is replicated in the lives of each of us. The wonder of being on this spinning earth, the vague, angel laden mists that hover about the path into the future, and still the joy of life coursing through our veins. And where did it go? Why the heaviness, the body ache, the soul fatigue, the ennui of brain and bone? What happened to that child, afraid but full of itself? What lives still in moments of spontaneity, in a lonely impulse of delight? And in the gossamer dreams that slip from awareness as we head off to work, he lives still, but very deep within. And he is weary and heavily laden with the Saturnian shadow. Let me illustrate with a personal example. Once in a while, my father would laugh or make a joke or even whistle. Even as a child, I came to realize that when he whistled, things were very dark indeed. However, even then, I recognized a heroic impulse on his part to invoke the cliche, he was whistling in the dark. After a while, I began to realize that when he whistled, it was not joy time, but dark time. All his good efforts notwithstanding, I knew things were difficult. My father had had to end his formal education in the eighth grade because his father had lost his business in agricultural equipment due to the Great Depression and the failure of the farms that hit the Midwest even before the crash of 29. The clear message to my father, to which he responded then and for the rest of his life, was that he had to sacrifice his own interest and work to support his people. Later, when I entered the picture as the elder child, he worked all day at Alice Calmer's on the assembly line, building tractors and earth moving equipment. And on nights and weekends, he drove a truck and shoveled coal into people's homes. In later years, he was promoted, ironically, to the position of analyst on the assembly line with the power to tell college educated engineers where they had screwed up. In his years there, he had learned the whole system. He could analyze the problems and became a troubleshooter. For 50 years, he showed up every Friday with his paycheck that paid or almost paid the bills outstanding. We never went hungry, as my best friend Kent sometimes did, but I knew even then that my father worried that we would. And I also received my first Saturnian message from him clearly and irrevocably, that to be a man meant to work. It meant to work always, any work which supposed any work which supported those for whom one was responsible. It meant that personal satisfaction was set aside before fidelity to that enormous responsibility. Years later, when a woman asked me what I wanted inscribed on my tombstone, I said, "Here lies one who could be counted upon." So powerful was this injunction that my father and later I was prepared to die for it and to be memorialized for it. Memorialized for it. Years later, when I wrote a note to my father on his birthday card, he responded across the gulf between us. "I am sorry I didn't get to know you boys so well because I was always working." He was taking on the blame for us growing and developing apart, even as I honored him for his fidelity and service to us. I knew he was serving us, suffering for us, warring on our behalf, and I never once thought ill of him for his work, but I also knew that it did not serve him. Even then I knew it did not serve him. But apparently that was what it meant to be a man. During these same formative years, World War II was unfolding. I saw the big folk gathered anxiously around the radio to hear of battles raging in Europe and the South Pacific, and to think on loved ones who were in such strange places as Tulugai, Mandano, and the ball turret of a B-17 Tau gunner. All of them did come back. The 24-year-old returned from the Philippines with his hair totally white and the tail gunner with a piece of flak in his leg. The blacked out curtains, tearful goodbyes in the train station, the obvious anxiety contributed to my sense of something large and awful transpiring, something in which we were all caught up. I also overheard them whispering atrocity stories, such as the one about the family who received a postcard from their son delivered by the International Red Cross. Under the stamp was written, "They cut my tongue out." Whether such stories were always true or not, the adults around me believed they were. That was enough for me. This constituted my second irrefutable message about being a man. I firmly believe that my fate, apart from being an economic animal, was to grow up and become a soldier and to go to some foreign place and kill or be killed, or come home tortured and maimed. I lie awake nights imagining my fated appointment with such horrors, just as all of the big people who lived through the Great Depression were irrevocably scarred and apprehensive. So, too, anyone who recalls war times shudders in recollecting the horror and the uncertainty. As a child in the Midwest, I was as far from the slaughtered cities as one could imagine. But the combat zones were everywhere, and we all were afraid. I had not even heard of such places as Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, and Mauthausen then. But when I was an adult, I visited them with my children. It was not all paranoia. There was something to worry about, and as a man, I was expected to be responsive and responsible. Such were the heaviest of the tapes of Saturn. Then, the three W's, one might say: work, war, and worry. All men will recall similar experiences. Each will be able to relate incidents where he felt called to something larger than his capacity to comprehend, pulled ineluctably into maelstrom. The child desperately hopes for information, for modeling, for leadership, for instruction, for help in coping with that which will shortly confront and perhaps overwhelm him. If one is to undertake such trials, the youth desperately hopes that they will take him aside and teach him what he needs to know. I recall once glimpsing such mysteries as I felt I needed in order to survive as a man. My father caught a fishhook in the palm of his hand and without expression of any kind pulled it out. I surmised that perhaps the big folk did not feel pain as we little folk did, but I rather suspected he had been taught that mysterious courage I so desperately needed. Perhaps it was not too much to hope that someday they would take me aside and teach me how to be a man. I guessed that it might occur when one went to high school. Without knowing about something called puberty, I could see that the folks in high school had bigger bodies than we, that we seemed on the adult side of the great gulf. But to my surprise and a disappointment, I feel to this day, they never took me aside and told me what it means to be a man and how to conduct myself as an adult. Today, of course, I know that they are the tribal elders of our time, did not know what it means to be a man either. They similarly were uninitiated and could hardly pass on the mysteries and liberating knowledge they themselves lacked. In my own halting fashion, I had tumbled to the necessity of rites of passage from childhood to manhood. Not only are such rites about transition from the dependencies of infancy to the self-sufficiency of adulthood, but equally about the transmission of such values as the quality and character of citizenship and those attitudes and beliefs that connect a person to his gods, to his society, and to himself. Yet such rites of passage withered and passed away long ago. It has often been said, notes Mircea Eliade, that one of the characteristics of the modern world is the disappearance of any meaningful rites of initiation. Even the phrase rites of initiation or rite of passage may not be understood in our time. A rite is a movement in an toward depth. Rites are not invented. They are found, discovered, experienced, and they rise out of some archetypal encounter with depth. The purpose of the symbolic act which the rites enact is to lead into or back toward that experience of depth. Obviously, rites repeated can lose their capacity to point beyond themselves into that depth, and they then become empty and sterile. Yet our need for the depth encounter persists in the symbiotic life. Jung speaks of how important it is for a tribe of Pueblo Indians to see their rituals as instrumental in helping the sun to rise. That gives peace when people feel that they are living the symbolic life, that they are actors in the divine drama. That gives the only meaning to human life. Everything else is banal, and you can dismiss it. A career producing of children are all Maya compared with that one thing, that your life is meaningful. Without meaningful rights, we sustain the most grievous of wounds to the soul, life without depth. The idea of passage is similarly essential, for all passages imply something ending, a death of sorts, and something beginning, a birth of sorts. Only death is static. The principle of life is change, and we have many deaths and rebirths to transit if we are to lead meaningful lives. Initiation implies entry into something new, something mysterious. Given the fact that rites of passage have largely disappeared from our culture, it behooves men to reflect as individuals on what those rites offered. For what it is not available through our culture, we are now obliged to find for ourselves. Despite the variety of cultures and specific local content, the archetypal stages of such rites of passage were remarkably similar. It seems that our predecessors had intuited the importance of such separations, and evolutions of personality, and they collectively grasped that these processes were necessary. The duration, intensity, and decisiveness of such rites were in direct proportion to the difficulty of truly leaving childhood and growing up. As few in our culture have managed, psychologically speaking, to separate, to grow up, it may profit us to reflect a while on the stages of initiatory experience. Again, what is not provided us by our culture is left to us to do as individuals. We cannot avoid the task through ignorance, for otherwise the developmental process becoming a man remains undone. Those patterns of passage may be summarized in 6 stages. While the content of each stage varied according to local custom, the stages themselves were explicit or implied in the various cultural patterns. The first stage of passage was separation, physical separation from the parents in order to begin the psychological separation. This was never a matter of choice for the boy. Often in the middle of the night, he would be kidnapped from his parents by the gods or the demons, the older men of the tribe who wore masks or painted their faces. These masks moved them from the familiar realm of neighbors or uncles to the status of gods, of archetypal forces. The abruptness, even violence of the separation was a reminder that no youth would voluntarily relinquish the comforts of the hearth. Its warmth, protection, and nourishment create an enormous gravitational pull. To remain by the hearth, literally or figuratively, is to remain a child and to forever forswear one's potential as an adult. Accordingly, the second stage of the passage was death. The boy would be buried, passed through a dark tunnel, plunged into some literal or symbolic darkness. While the experience would, of course, be terrifying, what the youth was undergoing was a symbolic death of childhood dependency. He was experientially suffering the loss of the hearth. You can't go home again. It was the loss of innocence, the loss of the Edenic connectedness of childhood. In dying, the child wakes to the farm, forever fled from the childless land, as Dylan Thomas expressed it. If there is death, then life must follow. So the third stage was a ceremony of rebirth. Sometimes a name change accompanied this rebirth, reinforcing the emergence of a new beginning. Christian baptism obviously symbolizes such a death rebirth motive through its return to the umbilical waters. Roman Catholic confirmation and Jewish bar and bat mitzvahs are survivors of this historic rites. The fourth stage of initiation typically involved the teachings, imparting such knowledge as the youth would require in order to function as an adult. The teachings were of 3 different kinds. Practical skills, such as hunting, fishing, defense, and herding, were critical. For the nascent man, who was to help sustain and protect his society, the privileges and responsibilities of adulthood and citizenship were similarly transmitted. And lastly, there was an introduction to the mysteries, so that the young person might have some sense of spiritual grounding and participation in the transcendent realm. Who are our gods? What sort of society, laws, ethics, spirit gifts did they bestow? Locating the person in a mythic context bestowed identity gave a sense of the greater framework in which he participated and deepened the soul of the youth. The fifth stage might be characterized as the ordeal. The content of the practices might vary, but the boy was required to suffer a separation from the comforts and protections of the hearth. I will say such more about this later, but what strikes us moderns as gratuitous cruelty was in fact a wise perception that such suffering quickened consciousness. Consciousness only comes from suffering. Without some form of suffering, physical, emotional, spiritual, we are content to rest easy in the old dispensation, the old comforts, the old dependencies. The second reason for such suffering, frankly, was to help inure the boy to the actual rigors of life he would experience soon enough. While seeming barbarous to us, such practices as circumcision and ritual scarification not only signaled the sacrifice of the comforts of the flesh and childhood dependencies, but were also a sign of election into the company of initiated adults. Perhaps most significantly, the ordeal usually involved some form of isolation, a retreat to a sacred space away from the community. The essential part of being an adult means not only that one can no longer turn back to the protection of others, but that one must learn to draw upon inner resources. No one knows he has them until he is obliged to use them. The natural world is dark and full of strange animals and demons, and the confrontation with one's fear is a moment of decisive significance. Ritual isolation is an introduction to a central truth that no matter how tribal our social life, we are on the journey alone and must learn to draw strength and solace from within, or we will not achieve adulthood. Often the initiation spent months alone, waiting perhaps for the great dream, a communication from the gods as to his true name or proper vocation. He learned to depend on his wits, his courage, and his weapons, or he perished. Upon return, the last stage, the boy was an adult. These rituals of passage were elaborate, wisely so, for they were extensive in direct relationship to the power of the mother complex, namely the enormous pull toward dependency in all of us. Elaborate and powerful emotional experiences are required to overcome this inertial gravity. No one in his right mind would willingly separate, hence lethargy, fear, and dependency dominate or threaten to the lives of us all. In traditional cultures, the rites were more elaborate for boys than for girls, for girls were expected to leave their personal, modern mothers, For girls were expected to leave their personal mothers but circle back to the hearth. Again, the rites of separation were decisive and powerful for boys, not only because of the power of the mother complex, but because boys were expected to separate from the natural world, the life of instinct, for an artificial man made world of culture. Economics, for example, is a wholly artificial construct. Money, paychecks, stock options, these are concepts upon which much of man's life depends and upon which much of his soul is projected. Food in the mouth or hunger our instinctual experiences, wampum, checks, or bonuses are artificial. To separate a child from the instinctual world requires a numinous construct, at least as powerful as his urge to settle back into unconsciousness. The elaborateness of the traditional rites of passage were necessary then to bridge the huge gulf between childhood and adulthood, between boyish, instinctual life and dependency and the independent self-sufficiency of manhood. If the rites worked, the boy experienced an existential change. He died as one being and became another. But as we all know, such rights today are missing. Such existential, transformation driven underground. If we ask a man, do you feel like a man? Chances are he will consider the question silly or threatening. He will know his roles, but he will neither be able to define what it means to be a man, nor will he likely feel he has measured up to any of his own partial definitions. In short, the wise elders are gone, lost to death, depression, alcoholism, or corporate boardrooms and golden parachutes. The bridge from childhood to manhood is washed out. As men have no meaningful rites of passage available to them, no wise elders to transmit what lies on the other side, they have necessarily had to take their clues from societal role expectations and essentially hollow role models. All the while, the pain and confusion to the soul is pushed inward or acted out violently or distanced from consciousness. Accordingly, the gap between wisdom and experience has been filled in by outer images, images which, as has been true for women as well, seldom feed the soul. Hence, the first of the great secrets to be openly acknowledged is that men's lives are as much governed by role expectations as are the lives of women. And the corollary is that those roles do not support, confirm, or resonate to the needs of men's souls. It is the growing awareness of this terrible discrepancy between role expectations and the needs of the soul that has given rise to what is called the men's movement. While no representative institution or body has emerged, such as the National Organization for Women, nor has there evolved a clear social-political agenda, the scattered men's groups and growing body of literature attest to the stirring of awareness that something is terribly wrong. The need for such a movement is succinctly summarized by John Lee. It's an emotional movement, a releasing of the pain and poison men have been holding in their collective stomachs for centuries. It is not power-oriented in any way, but powerful in that it frees men and their spirits from the tyranny of the old paradigm of don't feel, die younger than women, don't talk, don't grieve, don't get angry, don't rock the boat, don't trust other men, don't put passion before bill paying, follow the crowd, not your bliss. I concur entirely with these sentiments. However, the shadow of power inevitably creeps into any group, any movement. When overly socialized and domesticated, men have rightly felt a longing for something wild and very deep. Still, the average man will never join a group, would feel ridiculous meeting out in the forest to beat a drum, and will seldom risk being vulnerable with other men. I do not criticize those who have gone into the forest and wept and raged and beat the drum, for they have frequently found something needed for their souls. At the same time, such activity may have a much long-term relevance as bra burning now occupies in the long march of women toward dignity and equal opportunity. Bra burning was an important emotional release, for a few at least, but to my mind, such energies are more effectively spent in discussion, in court, and in working toward cultural change. We are still at an early stage of understanding men's experience, and many will have to find a form of emotional release and a way to share their pain with others. But I suspect that future generations will look back on this era of wild man retreats with a sort of bemused nostalgia, even as we think of the communities of the 60s, well intended, but having little impact on the course of history. Recently, I visited my son in Santa Fe, where he is living and struggling to be an artist. We drove up to the Jemez Mountains, so far up that the road ran out on us. We saw owls, deer, and two very large black birds sitting on a rock. When we got closer, we realized that the rock had legs and two predators were munching on a moose. We were far from civilization, and we joked that if it suddenly snowed, they would also find the bodies of two Anglos in the spring thaw. We returned to the Santa Fe Plaza with the warm feeling of having had a primal experience. Crossing the street, my son saw a leader of the local men's group and introduced me to him. Immediately, the man began quizzing me about what I knew, who I knew, if I had drummed, and so on. I felt myself pulled involuntarily into a competitive mode. Then, quite nicely, he invited me to attend a name-changing ceremony for two men reaching their 50th birthday the next day. When I said I had to fly out of Albuquerque to Atlantic City at 7:30 the next morning, he said, "I'll throw a fast one at you now. Why do you spend so little time with your son?" I began to say that I had to get back to work to pay the bills, a classic male defense and also reality, but my son interceded before I had finished, saying, "This is the third visit to see me this year." "Oh, okay," the man said, and we parted. My son and I reflected on the encounter and noted how, for all of the consciousness this man professed to have, he had negatively charged the meeting with male issues. He set me up to feel competitive, and I fell for it. Then he sought to shame me as a father. He was operating, I believe, without conscious malice, and I may indeed be guilty of compulsive working and be less than the perfect father, but both of us fell into the trap long prepared for men. Surely it is not the purpose of the men's movement to reinforce these old complexes to set men against each other as we unwittingly had. In the duel at high noon on the plaza in Santa Fe, no 6 guns were drawn, but shots were fired and wounds suffered in an exchange that lasted 240 seconds that reached back as far as memory. A man who was a leader of the movement had, in welcoming me, fired at me. Sizing me up, his complex was triggered, and he set about questioning me in ways that stir old passions, old competitive reflexes. Then suddenly, the shadow problems of power insinuated itself, and he sought to shame me as an absent father. His question aimed to set him one up, me one down. Imbued as he surely was with the precepts of the men's movement, the search for release from such games, he nonetheless triggered them. The exchange between us might be innocuous, and perhaps I make too much of it. But I think a slow motion replay allows us to see the role played by the unconscious, the complexes activated, and the reflexive behaviors that tie men to no-win positions. A complex, excuse me, A complex is an emotionally charged cluster of energy in the psyche. We may or may not be aware of such psychic charges, but when activated, they have the power to temporarily take over the conscious personality. Thus, the situation itself, two men meeting, sizing each other up, activated the complexes, and, against our conscious intent, we played out hysterically charged roles. On the collective level, men play out this competitive and shaming exchange daily, whether in academic or corporate turf wars or on the high seas and battlefields. In sizing each other up, as men do when they meet, the shadow of the power complex inevitably surfaces. The shadow represents that part of our psyche with which we may be uncomfortable or disdain, or that threatens ego intentions, but serves as a split off part of the soul nonetheless. Working with the shadow represents the only way of integrating it, for what is not integrated will be projected onto others or leak out in dangerous behavior. While the encounter of two men on the streets of Santa Fe is hardly an epic confrontation, still it constellates the archetype, the, ar- the archetypal problem of power with all its attendant fears and defenses. This leads us to the second male secret, that men's lives are essentially governed by fear. Because men cannot undo what fragile strength they have assembled, they can scarcely admit to themselves or others how much fear influences them. But the healing of a man will require that he cease feeling ashamed by his fear. I have always admired the freedom of women to acknowledge their fears, to share them, and thereby reap the support of others. For a man to so acknowledge the place of fear in his life is to risk feeling unmanly and to expect shaming by others. So his isolation deepens. But this secret is out, fellows. Even your women are onto you. Indeed, they always have been. While researching this book, I came across an article in the March 1992 issue of Yes, Ladies' Home Journal, Men's Secret Fears. What he'll never tell you. So they have found us out. In essence, the article correctly identifies men's two fundamental fears, the fear of not measuring up and the fear of physical or psychological trial. Notice the latent expression of the twin worries I discovered in childhood: work and war. Work and war. The fear of not measuring up is a Saturnian shadow at its most obvious. Competition, winners, losers, productivity as the measure of manhood, the fear of trial, the fifth phase of the initiatory rites is expressed by men who doubt their ability to defend themselves and their family. How many films from Straw Dogs to Cape Fear have stirred this caveman in us, defender of the hearth? Indeed, many men confide that they are more afraid of illness, incapacity, and impotence than of death. When I have said as much to an audience on the logical face of its absurd, for what could be more frightening than death? Invariably, men have nodded their heads. Yes, they are more afraid of the trial, of failing the ordeal, than of death itself. Impotence, powerlessness in any of its forms is worse than annihilation. Work, war, and worry. Governed as he is by fear, unable to admit this to himself, lest his hold on things slip, unable to share with his comrades, lest he be ashamed a man compensates. The man who boasts of his big car or big house or big position with a big title is surely compensating to some degree for how small he feels. Upscale lunches and power over others may serve an edifice complex, but they are pathetic substitutes for genuine empowerment. As that late great American philosopher Pearl Bailey expressed it, them's what thinks they is, ain't? Beneath displays of power is the complex. Beneath the complex lies fear. No animal is more dangerous than one that is frightened. Perhaps Freud was right when he said that all things were sexual, or Adler in giving primacy to power. For when Eros is injured, it resorts to the gambit of power. The power complex is the central force in the lives of men. It drives them and wounds them. Out of their rage, they wound others, and out of their sorrow and shame, they grow more and more distant from each other. The cost of this mutual wounding is enormous, repetitive, and cyclic. Whatever is unconscious is internalized in debilitating ways or projected into others and acted out destructively. The cost of these first two secrets, that man's lives are as much governed by role expectations as women's, and that men are secretly ruled by fear, is rather easy to discern in the sufferings of individual men and their pathology of our society. American men die, on the average, 8 years before women. They are 4 times more likely to be substance abusers and also 4 times more likely to take their own lives. They are 11 times more likely to spend time in jail. And these statistics do not even begin to plumb the depth of male rage, male sadness, male isolation. The men's movement is a welcome response to this suffering, which is obvious and hidden. I would not demean the desire of men to create a safe space where they might gather together to share initiatory, life deepening experiences. But I believe that ultimately change comes through the individual. Sharing has its place, but personal change is primary. Marxists have rightly critiqued the capitalist social structure most of us have grown up serving. Karl Marx, in my view, was a humanitarian who saw the evils of his day and subsequently ours, and expressed not only his rage but his vision of the alternative, the classless society. Sadly, however, his vision is repudiated by the gulags, the pogroms, and the thousand reminders that whosoever ignores the worth and weight of the individual will only create a new tyranny. In seeking to improve the material status of man, at the same time Marx devalued his spiritual status and thus created an edifice that would ultimately collapse. As we were told 2,000 years ago, we do not live by bread alone. Therefore, although valuing social action, I know that all institutions end by serving their own survival and not the cause for which they were founded. Similarly, although I have the necessity and the intentions of the men's movement, I also know that wherever 2 or 3 are gathered, there too is the shadow of power. Accordingly, this book is written for individual men and for the women who stand in relationship to them, join groups, share with other men, but it is in the smithy of the private soul that the modern man must be born. It is only through the capacity to discern what forces course within him, that he would determine a man's return or not, to the organization, to the marriage, to the society at large as part of the solution. Jungian analysis, James Hillman, has recently criticized the long struggle for consciousness in an iconoclastic book. We've had 100 years of psychotherapy and the world is getting worse. His point is valid, but I believe that group action can be no more efficacious than the sum of individual consciousness brought to it. Men of good will have created bureaucratic monsters and institutions to torture others, spreading a terrible darkness. In his 1937 lectures at Yale, Jung made an indelible point. The new man must bear the burden of the shadow consciously, for such a man knows that whatever is wrong in the world is in himself. And if he only learns to deal with his own shadow, he has done something real for the world. He has succeeded in shouldering at least an infinitesimal part of the gigantic, unsolved social problems of our day. These problems are mostly so difficult because they are poisoned by mutual projections. How can anyone see straight when he does not even see himself and the darkness he unconsciously carries with him into all his dealings? Thus, in the following pages, I invite individual men to reflect on those forces that contend within them. What we do not understand in ourselves is projected unto our surroundings. And so the sum of our society is the aggregate of what is unconscious in each of us. In sharing the dreams and dilemmas of individual men, I show how we are all personally affected by the same issues. The more fully we understand how we relate inwardly to the feminine, the more able are we to disentangle the skein of relationship with an actual woman. In understanding the necessary wounding of our sensibilities, we can suffer the world's monstrous pathologies without become monsters ourselves. In acknowledging our deep hunger for the tribal fathers, we can more nearly parent ourselves. The roles and expectations, the shadow of Saturn, rest heavily on us all. We can continue to blame them, those who mysteriously invented and institutionalized all of this, but then nothing will change. We can no longer wait for something to change out there. Even with a men's movement afoot, we must change ourselves. All change starts within, but we men often have trouble internalizing our experience. So the task is difficult, but it is far preferable to living forever under Saturn's shadow. Recap of the introduction. Remember the 8 secrets men carry within. Number 1, men's lives are much governed by restrictive role expectations, as are the lives of women. 2, men's lives are essentially governed by fear. 3, the power of the feminine is immense in the psychic economy of men. 4, men collude in a conspiracy of silence whose aim is to suppress their emotional truth. 5, because men must leave mother and transcend the mother complex, wounding is necessary. 6, men's lives are violent because their souls have been violated. 7, every man carries a deep longing for his father and for his tribal fathers. 8. If men are to heal, they must activate within what they did not receive from without.